Hello there, and a very cool welcome to this, the latest edition of the DF Direct Q&A show. I say cool because the UK has just made its way through its fifth heat wave of the year, and we've emerged unscathed. It looks like cool weather from here on out, but who knows. Joining me to discuss the questions this week, first of all, Tom Morgan. Hello.
Hello. All of that is for naught, I think, because I've kept the windows closed and the fan off in this room for acoustic reasons. But it'll be fine. It's going to be fine. It's nice to be here.
It'll be fine, yeah. And also joining us, Oliver McKenzie. Hello.
Yes, the weather's been pretty good in Vancouver, but regardless, I've stayed chilled in my apartment with my mini split unit insulated from any heat and any consequences in here, so I really couldn't tell you too much about the outdoors.
Good for you.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased to hear.
It's lovely.
But before we go on, I just want to make a shout out here. We've updated the Digital Foundry merch store. We have our new pint glass. Yes, you can now consume your beverages in pint-like configuration with our special DM glass. Highly recommended. Do check it out. store.digitalfoundry.net. Okay, so let's tackle our first topic. A question here that comes from what does dog need with a starship? Good question. Question/comment about the Oblivion Remastered lack of performance on multiple platforms. So my cursory investigation, it seems the original engine called Gamebryo for this game doesn't work very well with multiple cores/threads. So one could assume that that's why even with 6 available cores on Switch 2 and even more on PS5, it's probably still limited by the performance and throughput of a single CPU core. So synchronizing with the Unreal Engine shell must completely block the single thread running the base game engine, causing these horrible stutters and lack of scaling, even with big gun PC rigs. That's just my guess as a non-game programmer, but do we have any evidence to this effect? As an aside, it's a shame the game program isn't open source. Maybe somebody could take a crack at it and fix the issues if Bethesda isn't capable of fixing things itself, despite all the money we're throwing at them. So this question comes in the wake of the release of Oblivion Remastered for Nintendo Switch 2 last week, where essentially there was a lot of demand from Bethesda to actually go back to the existing versions of the game, Xbox, PC, and PlayStation, to improve them, because there's fundamental issues here that have never really been fixed. And, you know, the evidence of a Switch 2 port, on the one hand, does confirm that there is ongoing development with Oblivion Remastered, but it doesn't extend to actually fixing what I think we could safely say is a pretty broken game. There's also some conjecture that there are optimizations for the Switch 2 version. And maybe those optimizations could be brought across to the existing versions of the game. We actually have this comment, this tweet from Bethesda Game Studio. We've heard your feedback asking for an additional patch for Oblivion Remastered. The Nintendo Switch 2 version of the game has a number of optimizations that we are looking into bringing to other platforms, and we will share more when we are able. Tom, first of all, I believe that the feedback from users here is entirely justified. The concept of actually bringing out an entirely new version of Oblivion Remastered when the existing game hasn't been touched for over a year and has profound issues. I think it's a fair comment to say, well, hey, what's going on here? I guess I've got two questions to you. Can you just sort of sum up the existing issues with Oblivion Remastered? I mean, we've done it before. We did it in May. We did a sort of recap.
Yeah.
A health check
on
the game. And it failed, I think it's fair to say. Do you think there are optimizations in the Switch 2 version that could be brought to bear in attempting to fix that particularly poor showing?
I mean, when you release a tweet like that, you're releasing it in the context of there being so many performance issues. So when they use the word optimization, I'm hoping they're looking at one of the big three with the existing code, the unstable frame pacing at 30, the hitching, and the crashing. And let's add a fourth tier to that, the degrading performance.
There's the fourth.
Yes, so there's the 4 things that they had on the sort of to-do list for any version, to be honest, not Switch 2, but the Switch 2 presented a kind of a fresh chance to have a go at it. And, they've got this team at Virtuous and Bethesda working side by side on this. It's true that the original coding behind the scenes, the skeleton, as Todd Howard put it, the bones, of the original game are in place, which means that there is this segmented world design where there will be hitches at certain points in the open world, less of an issue in dungeons and cities. But it does mean that, no matter what platform we've been playing on, PS5, Xbox, Switch 2, there is a specific point in my run, which I'm sure if you've seen my coverage of Oblivion so far, I've done it repeated times, there's always that point in the world where it just tanks down to, sub 120 millisecond frame times, what have you. So that is obviously still there on Switch 2, and that has not been addressed. The hitching side is not addressed because it's part and parcel with the original Gamebryo coding underneath the UE5 layer. Then there's obviously the stutter, like the uneven frame pacing at 30. I think we knew that was going to happen either way, given it wasn't solved to this point over a year on PS5 and Xbox. And then there's the state of crashing as well. Crashing is interesting because we achieved it consistently on PS5 and Xbox by running through a gamut of saves and just like banking on a memory leak, basically like 20 saves in and loading each one in turn. You'd get there and it'd crash, which I didn't managed to achieve on Switch 2 in the time I had with it. I actually set up exactly the same saves in all the exact same points. I was very meticulous about it and got to the point where I was going through all of them, and that didn't crash it. What did crash it was just playing the game regularly and relying on the autosave to get me back to life after being killed by an enemy, and that did. Now, I've heard a few comments saying similar, that they had issues with just reloading, going to the an auto-saved a save slot and coming back, it just goes to a black screen, and then you've got to kind of quit out to the menu. So that might be the point that they've fixed, honestly, because the theory we had was that it was a memory leak, and that leads us to the fourth bit, which is the degrading performance. There's no evidence of that here. Like I wasn't able to, at least with a 30 FPS cap in Oblivion on Switch 2, there's no way to actually degrade the performance by playing more and more based on what I've tried, which was also the case on Series S, which only runs at 30, and the quality modes on the other PS5 and Xbox versions. So
right.
I'd say inconclusive on that front. Crashing, the lack thereof when loading loads of saves, is maybe positive. Maybe that's where the word optimization has come in, and that's where that has been put into effect. But yeah, I think we talked about this after my video went live, Rich, over Slack, and we were saying, well, I didn't put a firm conclusion in right at the end of my video about, did their statement come to fruition? Did they actually fix any of the issues? And I think on all four counts, it's hard to be conclusive, especially when two of those points at least are, still in place. You can still see the stuttering, the uneven frame pacing, and the hitching, and the other two, the crashing and the degrading performance, are, they're still there, or you can't really assess them with the 30 FPS cap. So yeah, I'm very curious. Maybe it's more bug fixes. Maybe there's optimizations that we can't see that would need to reach out to them for the development team. But from what I can see, there's just nothing to get my teeth into in terms of something to be positive about for a future PS5 patch.
Right, yeah. I think that's the bottom line. That the conclusion I came away from your video, Tom, was basically that the key issues that we identified in the existing versions of the game, possibly with the exception of the memory leak thing, I mean, it looks like business as usual, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's Oblivion Remastered. And on the one hand, the quality of the remastering itself was never really a point of contention. It was basically the technical performance of the game. And I think the way they've actually managed the conversion to Switch has been quite intelligently done. The cutbacks are there, but they're not in any way intrusive to the point where you feel it's not a good game from that perspective. The turnout is certainly a good deal better than the Nintendo Direct footage that we saw.
Yeah, for sure.
Which was like all over the place. There were some real issues there. So in that sense, okay, it's a pretty good port, but it's a pretty good port that unfortunately retains the key problems that the existing versions had. So I'm not sure to the extent which they can actually fix it. And going to the comments made here by what does dog need with a starship? As to whether it's single core related or not, obviously we don't really know unless we had like a performance analyzer, which we don't. We're kind of on the outside looking in. But, it is the existing original engine essentially running wrapped within Unreal Engine 5. So it's a pretty good conjecture to be made. Either way, the physical evidence of the behavior is certainly consistent with that original engine. And it would need significant overhauling to fix it. And they didn't fix it for the other versions. It doesn't look like they fixed it here. Thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah, from what I understand or what I've read up on, how are they maintaining state between Gamebryo and UE5 and how prone to that is that necessarily lending itself to some of the crashing behavior we've seen and some of the hitching behavior we've seen, in particular when you're crossing over cells in Oblivion, the kinds of problems that you tend to see there, the kinds of hitching you tend to see there, the degraded performance in terms of that mixing and matching between the original code and the UE5 code. I think there could be some element, some interaction that's causing problems. But I mean, on the positive side, Switch 2 does suggest, I think, that if you scale back maybe object count and draw calls a little bit, you can actually get the game into a okay, sort of, maybe not really, but okay in some respects, state on worse hardware. And I think what that suggests possibly is that if you took that same bucket of compromises, which are pretty steep from a visual perspective, right? But if you take that same bucket of compromises and you were to translate that to a device like the PS5 or Series X or something, you might actually get a more playable experience, I'd assume. So I think that to me is interesting. Now, would you want to make those compromises on that class of hardware? Perhaps not, but maybe it's a possibility. I don't know. The other performance issue that really does get to me, though, is the 30 FPS with uneven frame pacing. We've seen this a lot on Switch 2. Really, it shouldn't occur. Some developers just don't seem to have gotten the memo, and apparently Virtuous is one of those developers, unfortunately. I'm kind of a split opinion on Oblivion on Switch 2, because it is really impressive visually. Like, I'm super glad they managed to maintain the RT reflections. The Lumen GI presentation looks very good. I think they're using some kind of modified full-fat Lumen, kind of like we saw with Layers of Fear, where maybe, they're making some cuts, curtailing some things, lowering resolution, things like this, but they're achieving a substantially good lighting presentation, which I quite liked, at least judging from Tom's footage. That's pretty cool. But I'm kind of torn because the port itself is impressive in some ways, right? Very pleasing port. Would I ever want to play this game on Switch 2? No. No, I would not. But I wouldn't want to play it on any other console hardware either. So, hey, that at least suggests some kind of broad parity in terms of we achieved an unacceptable good-looking experience, kind of, sort of. But would you want to play it? That's another kind of question.
Yeah.
And I think with these games that run with unlocked frame rates, stuttering, frame pacing issues, it kind of mix and match these in a bucket, and I'm just not happy with that kind of outcome, right? It's just not a satisfying experience.
I'm totally there with you.
Put that in the box. I'm not happy with that, with that outcome.
I'm totally there with you, Oliver.
Sorry, Tom.
It's just that there was a ceiling, right, of our what we expected could be possible, which was the existing versions, and it comes remarkably close. Like genuinely, the initial impressions when you're going through the first dungeon, and you see the enemies up close, the new models, the lighting. It's actually I was genuinely impressed. And it, as you say, it's heartening to see the UE5 layer side of the Oblivion Remaster thriving on Switch 2 hardware. Like that, the features are intact, the Lumen is there, that level of fidelity is possible in future titles using UE5 on that system. And obviously they won't be encumbered by the Gamebryo stuff in the background like other games, will go on to do different things. So that was good news. So on the visual level, great. On a fundamental sort of the bones part of the package, it's just woeful. I think I got about halfway, actually 3/4 of the way through the video I was making, and I was kind of leaning towards the performance is bad. But I mean, if you've made your peace with the PS5 version, was the original line I had in my script. If you've made your peace with the PS5 version, you're kind of in a similar ballpark. But then I found this atrocious, 1-2 second stutter, which I put in the video. And I then realized, okay, there's no way this is even similar to the PS5 version. This is Switch 2 stuff that it just likely CPU-based limitations handling all this, and that just tips it over into hard to recommend, that disappointing, frustrating. So
yeah, I mean, when you're showing 0 FPS on the frame rate counter, that's a bit of an issue.
Yeah,
that shouldn't make it into a shipping game.
Exactly.
Call me a crazy old traditionalist, but
give us one
really
frame a second at least.
No, it was 0.
Yeah, I know.
It was on your graph.
No, I know.
Yeah, the whole memory, the performance degradation thing, which we thought was a memory leak. I mean, if it wasn't in the Series S, and it's not in Switch 2, again, is there an actual optimization there, or is there actually some sort of different reason behind the performance degradation that you saw on Series X and PlayStation 5?
Yeah.
I just don't think that. I think there's the hope here that well over a year after release, that there would be attempts to fix some of the primary issues that we've highlighted. And there haven't been. And in the meantime, a new version has come out. And now we're being told, actually, there's some optimizations here, which we can roll back into the previous versions. Cool. Again, priorities. Surely the priority should have been to fix the existing versions first. I mean, it's all a bit weird. But I think from my perspective, the core issues, and you highlighted 4 of them there, there's the possibility that 1 has been fixed, and that's not great.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see. I mean, we've got the data. We've got archived data of each of the phases of the game. So if and when there is a patch, we'll go back and take a look at it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. Question here from Marcus. Hiya, Foundryman! Exclamation point. Following Oliver's discussion of next-gen PC requirements, are we perhaps overemphasizing VRAM as a measure of longevity? The 3090 versus 5080 seems like a useful test. The 3090 has 24 gigabytes, but surely its compute and RT performance will become limiting eventually. Meanwhile, a modern 16 gigabyte card may not always match PS6/Helix texture or geometry settings, but could still deliver a very similar 60 frames per second experience at slightly reduced settings. Especially with a long PS5 cross-gen period and technologies like neural texture compression, could 16 gigabyte become a settings limitation rather than a genuine longevity cliff? In other words, should we distinguish between the hardware needed to match next-gen consoles exactly and the hardware needed simply to have a good next-gen experience? I hope you have a good week! Exclamation point. Well, jury's out on that. We'll see, won't we? Oliver, so yeah, this was a question that we were discussing in a Q&A recently, where it's like, what PC specs do you need to match or what we believe the next-generation consoles are going to be? And the general received wisdom on the internet is that, okay, it's going to be kind of like 5070 Ti, 5080 performance.
Yeah.
But you certainly stirred up a hornet's nest by saying, well, actually, if they've got that much more memory, maybe you'll need a 5090. And Reddit went bananas. So
yeah.
Do you want to clarify what you meant? And what do you think of Marcus's point?
I do want to clarify what I said a bit, because I think what I said possibly was a bit more inflammatory in the moment than what I intended to convey, which is basically that you look at the question that we were asked originally, and it was basically, can we be reasonably confident? What hardware could you buy today and be reasonably confident that games targeting the PS6 generation would run at optimized settings in 60 FPS? Now, I took targeting the PS6 generation and optimized settings to mean console equivalent, because that's what we mean generally when we say optimized settings. It means like similar to the consoles, or even in some cases better than the consoles, right? Judging from Alex's test, that's kind of how we use that terminology. So will a 16 gigabyte card give you good experience in PS6 and Helix games? I think if the next generation consoles ship with 30 gigabytes plus, even if they do, I think a 16 gigabyte card will give you a good experience in those titles, because games developed for those systems will also be developed for PS5 for the most part. And they'll also be developed to look good on the vast majority of PCs, which will have cards with, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes, 10 gigabytes, whatever. I think they'll probably run in some respect okay on those cards, at least okay on those cards. But will they offer a console equivalent, full-on console level settings if PS6 ships with 30 gigs? Probably not. Maybe you'll have to take a cut somewhere. Maybe that'll mean losing the strand here. Maybe that'll mean losing texture resolution. Maybe that'll mean going down RT settings. Maybe that'll mean using low resolution shadow maps, right? Low resolution cascades, whatever. It might still look good, but it might not be at that same level, because if you have 30 gigabytes on hand, developers are going to use that 30 gigabytes. Doesn't matter. Maybe we do get some crazy neural texture compression. Maybe we get all kinds of crazy technologies. But if you have 30 gigs, and of that, let's say, 26 gigs, however many gigs, 25 gigs are accessible to developers. Of that, maybe you're using 20 gigs for graphics. I'm not sketching out a crazy scenario here. This is just how things tend to go on the consoles. But with that said, I think even though earlier leaks from the likes of Kepler_L2, they said PS6 would have 30 gigs rather, and Helix would have 36 gigs, which makes sense because 30 gigs is a supported configuration on a 160-bit bus, which is what has been reported the PS6's memory bus is going to be. I don't think Sony will ship 30 gigs on PS6. I think the more likely capacity at this point is 20 gigs, which is also supported on a 160-bit bus with 2 gigabyte modules, or I guess 4 gigabyte modules, but could be 2 gigabyte modules in like a 10 module configuration, clamshell, whatever. I think that makes more sense with current memory prices. So I guess my overall conclusion to this whole question is like, I think a 5070 Ti, 9070, 12 to 16 gigs should run you really well in a lot of games for a good long time to come. Think about the next 3-4 years. I think it'll be fine in the vast majority of titles. But if next generation consoles ship with 30 gigabytes, especially if they ship with 30 gigabytes, I think over time you might be out of luck. And I think because we, as this user is pointing out, because we have games that are doing PS5 cross-gen, do you need strict console equivalents? Like, let's say the advantage of Helix is just they've kind of whacked up strand hair, and they've whacked up texture resolution, they've whacked up shadow map resolution. Do you need those things to have a good experience? I would say no, right? So there's a lot of complication here, but I think this, if you basically take it as read that next-gen consoles have a ton of memory, then yeah, to match them, you'll need a ton of memory too. I don't know what else to say. You're going to need a lot of memory, but do I think that's going to happen? At this point, probably not, I would have to say, because that'll be really, really expensive to match.
Yeah, just to clarify here that console specs were basically finalized at the SoC level likely years ago, right? So in terms of like changing direction on next generation consoles, there's very limited latitude available to Sony and Microsoft. It is essentially they can change clock speeds, for example. They can, but crucially, they can add or they can subtract memory. Now, obviously, with the PlayStation 4 era, there's strong evidence that they added to the PlayStation 4, went from 4 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes. I've seen documentation that said that PS4 had 4 gigabytes of memory, and there was a big surprise in February 2013 when it actually turned out it was 8. So I've seen the documents. So, that's an example of going in one direction, but equally, you can go in the other. And I always thought that 36 gigabytes of memory was profligate. I thought it was a very, very large amount of memory, bearing in mind what we're seeing with PCs now, doing 24 with 24 gigabytes of overall memory. That was kind of surprising. So I wouldn't be surprised if they pull them back. I wouldn't be surprised if they also redouble their efforts on neural texture compression, because it seems like an obvious win in order to mitigate a loss of physical memory. But the truth is, we don't really know. Yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from there. And it's an interesting comparison there that Marcus comes up with the 3090 and the 5080, which is essentially a compute versus memory debate there. I mean, the 5080 is, if you're gaming today, the 5080 is a lot better than a 3090. So I can see where he's kind of coming from there. Have any thoughts on this one, Tom?
It would be echoing your point, I think, that I know a few developers that are using neural compression algorithms to cut down on install sizes, but the net benefit also is on memory compression as well. And yeah, it seems like the path forward for working smarter with the memory you've got in a climate where there's just not so much availability of memory. So I think that's likely the way things will go, and the way we'll save there.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see how this all plays out. And, there is also the elephant in the room, which is the PlayStation handheld, which, could be the machine that actually ships next year. And it might sort of stave off the whole PS6 question for another year. But certainly all of the messaging and indications from Microsoft have been basically saying Helix is 2027. So that is somewhat pressing. Okay, let's move on. Okay, then next question. And it's an interesting one for sure from Yotsuya. The PS5 Series XS spent years in cross-gen territory, and yet with the Switch 2, Nintendo swiftly finished up Switch 1 development and is now squarely focused on Switch 2. This has given the Switch 2 an already ample library of reasons to buy the system. How are Nintendo able to pull this off? Interesting question, right, Oliver? Because we've been told by, everybody basically in development that it's cross-gen is here to stay for a very, very long time. But Nintendo haven't really got the memo, have they? They have concentrated on producing exclusive experiences for Switch 2. There's no hint of Mario Kart World coming to Switch 1 or anything like that. They have managed to pull it off, but how?
Yeah, I honestly think that because Nintendo kind of ends up setting the pace for their own hardware in terms of what the software landscape looks like, I think they can kind of make calls that are a bit more aggressive than other platform holders. In addition, possibly the lower cost their games enables it. But if you look at where Nintendo sits on any given Switch system, I believe on Switch 1, they were responsible for about half of game revenues on Switch 1. So I think that they can basically set the pace for people and do things like shipping a gigantic game like Mario Kart World on day one, even though they're shipping into an install base of 0 systems initially, right? And even though the more prudent short-term financial move would be to ship the game on original Switch systems, I think they just do it because they understand that in the long run, if they build a successful platform, that means greater game sales overall later in the generation. And then there's a big cut of third-party sales that move to that system if they can push people into this new system, which is going to be their flagship platform for probably the better part of a decade, as far as we know. I think the other platform holders don't have the same latitude because their lineups are more third-party dominated, and Microsoft and Sony are going to have a heck of a time convincing the likes of Take-Two and Activision and EA to stop shipping on last-gen consoles so they can move more console units of a PlayStation 6. I just don't think that's what they like to do. And so they kind of just go with the flow and they ship a lot of cross-gen software. Nintendo doesn't want to do it. Nintendo really does believe in the console generation, really does want to ship new units, their new consoles, and Sony ends up in this situation where they still have 30-odd million PS4s being used every month because they haven't fully committed, or they did not fully commit to PS5 for a long period, in the same way that Nintendo has with Switch 2. So I think it's just a difference of Nintendo is the primary publisher on Switch by a gigantic margin, so they just set the rules for how things go.
Interesting. Yeah, Tom, in previous directs, we've been talking about the challenges facing the next generation of consoles in that they need to find a meaningful difference in order to get people to move on from PS5 to PS6 or whatever. And that's difficult if you don't have exclusive games for that platform. And Nintendo seems to have actually done exactly that, delivered exclusive games and definitely just almost turned their back on the Switch 1.
Yeah, and credit to them, honestly. I'm looking at a list of the exclusive Switch 2 games, and I'm running through my mind what would be possible on Switch 1, in terms of the, we said at launch, Mario Kart World, they've expanded the number of karts to the point where it probably would make life very difficult on the original Switch, at least, theoretically. Donkey Kong Bonanza, all the physics there, it's tricky. There are some cases where I think maybe it could have been possible. Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, possible. I don't know.
Right.
But it's that comes down to, I think, a bit of shrewdness in terms of the business making. They've done this. Nintendo historically, every generation, they've committed hard to their new machine, and it's a promise. It's a pledge to the audience, right? Which we don't necessarily have on PS4 and PS5. There's always one exception, that Zelda usually goes cross-gen right at the start. There's usually a Twilight Princess or what have you. But it's outside of that, beyond that window, it's only on the new console, and that makes it way more appealing to buy the Switch 2, honestly. There's also the technical side of it, which I think is it's true that there's a bit of a plateau in terms of what we're getting out of each new generation with the PS5. With Switch 2, we're still looking at sort of a level back in terms of what Switch 1 wasn't able to achieve a lot of things that were possible on PS5 and Series X. So getting to Switch 2, we now kind of have that parity in terms of development capabilities in some respects. We're getting ports from Street Fighter 5, Oblivion Remastered. A lot of cross-gen games are now possible with that tier of performance. So I think if we were to look at a Switch 3, we might be seeing Nintendo Switch strategies, because it might not be worth the squeeze for some developers to focus only on the next Nintendo console. But yeah, so it makes a lot of sense.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, interesting point, because I don't think it's physically capable of producing some of these games on the Switch 1 without like massive compromises, which doesn't really serve the audience.
Yeah.
So, to a certain extent, Nintendo actually delivered a proper generational leap in that regard. And that's kind of what we wanted to see, really. Oliver?
I guess I kind of just took it as read a little bit in the question that, if you did ship a version of Mario Kart World or Donkey Kong Bonanza, as Tom suggested, on Switch 1, I think you could do it, but it would compromise the game on Switch 1, number one, and also compromise the game on Switch 2, because they're designing a game around limitations of weaker system. Now, we know from Nintendo that they did start development for both those titles, and probably several others, as far as we would probably understand, on Switch 1, and then moved development over to Switch 2. So we know that there's a version of those games that was running on Switch 1 that could run on Switch 1. Maybe Mario Kart World would have been 30 FPS. Maybe it would have had, 10 races. Maybe Donkey Kong Bonanza would have had smaller worlds than 30 FPS, or whatever the case may be. But that wouldn't sell Switch 2 as well if those titles, number one, existed on Switch 1, and number two, weren't as compelling on Switch 2 because of gameplay decisions that were made to suit a much weaker class of hardware.
Yeah, there's two buckets, isn't there? There's tech reasons and business reasons. And, you can't convince me that Mario Tennis Fever couldn't run on Switch 1.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's move on. Okay, our next question, it comes from Skyrim Fest 26 FPS edition. I once asked the question, if Xbox didn't make another console, would anything be lost? I think back then your conclusion was that there was value in it, but given how Helix seems likely to have been positioned, do you still hold that view? Personally, I see Xbox as having already become more like the Microsoft mothership, fundamentally a software company that ships high quality but low volume hardware. I think we might all be better off if they focused on producing high quality games on reasonable budgets and timetables. Helix will end up being a distraction and risks being an embarrassing market failure that will only serve to illustrate the loss of trust people have in Xbox as a hardware platform when it sells less than the Steam Deck. I think they're going to have to work pretty hard to achieve that, to be honest. But Oliver, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I think the difficulty is that we've been trying to read the tea leaves on Microsoft's strategy for next generation for a couple of years now, since the rumors emerged of what the next generation Xbox is going to be. And since, to be fair, Phil Spencer started talking about the concept of a more open machine, right? Right at this point, I think it's really difficult to answer this question because we don't know how the positioning of Helix. It seems to have become a lot murkier since the Spencer era. It does seem to be the case that Asher Sharma has identified the need for an anchor, a hardware anchor for Xbox, for Game Pass, for the platform, which does suggest a bit of an about face from the Spencer era, where it was basically, okay, we need a machine, basically a Game Pass machine, if you like. But we also want this proliferation of devices, so we don't really mind if you don't buy it. That seems to have changed, right?
Yeah, it does seem to have changed in the Asha era, in part with her comments about the idea of allowing third-party storefronts on a future Xbox console on Helix. She seemed to poo-poo that idea, or at least seemed like she was a little bit unsure of herself or did not want to communicate too much on that idea, whereas Phil Spencer seemed to be embracing it much more wholeheartedly. She's also recommitted to game exclusives. We understand that there was a version of Gears of War Ide. I mean, I don't have any particular information on this, but this was widely reported by various outlets that was in development for PS5, and then it was canceled seemingly right before it was shown for Xbox consoles and PC, right at the game showcase they ran back in June. We also know that Asha has said there need to be new Xbox Series updates, I think, bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, for Series consoles, new console software updates. And she also, there was some interesting messaging that accompanied certain Xbox price rises recently, where they said, hey, you can pay with Klarna, pay for your new Series X that costs, $700, $800 with Klarna to alleviate the damage to your wallet, at least in the short term. Perhaps in the long term, that's not so good. So I think they're trying to find ways to make Xbox Helix a mass market proposition, which is kind of difficult if you look at the spec and when you look at what they're trying to achieve with it. It is not a mass market product, as I think Sarah Bond put it. It's a premium product. It's a high-end product. It's not designed for the mass consumer. It's designed as kind of an off-ramp from the console business for dedicated, enthusiastic Xbox players. It's not designed as a mass market console, but they're going to try to get there. I don't know if it's going to be Klarna. I don't know if it's going to be streaming. I don't know if it's going to be reduced spec hardware. I don't know if it's going to be some combination of the three. It's going to be something. So I think, yeah, totally. The answer to the question depends completely on what Microsoft wants to do. In terms of the value of Helix, I mean, I think Helix seemed like an interesting idea to try to bring PC gaming and Xbox together and trying to improve that, the playability of the PC as a platform with a controller on a couch. I think that's great. Is Microsoft the best position to do that? I don't know. Maybe they are as the platform holder. Certainly Valve has done a better job with Steam Big Picture and certainly the Steam Machine and SteamOS than Microsoft has recently. But yeah, it's kind of up in the air. I'm really curious to see how they unveil the console formally and what it will end up looking like. But at the moment, I just don't think there is a coherent vision for Xbox Helix that's survived Xbox administrations. I think they've changed their mind on a few key things, and I'm curious to see how that will materialize in the final product.
Yeah,
that's an interesting point. Tom?
Yeah, the changing of the guard has, and there's been multiple. You can sense flip-flops within the team on when this is going to be released, what the specs are, what the vision is. So it's very hard to get a grasp on a firm answer to this question from Skyrim Fest 26 FPS edition. It's just like, how do we assess this fairly so early on? I think it's very clear. It must be clear within Microsoft that they need to improve their messaging, and whatever they come out with next, their big push for their Project Helix will have to be very tight on what it does, who it's for, pricing, what's the deal with exclusives on Xbox as well. A huge part of the value for me with Xbox has been looking 10 years back now, the exclusives, but in recent years less so. So they really need to lock that down to make it clear. If they want it to be more than a niche thing for the very enthusiast gamer and appeal to a broader spectrum of users, then they need to really nail those points.
I think the Phil Spencer, Sarah Bond strategy was basically looking forward, or looking ahead rather, to a time where it's probably not going to be cost efficient to actually make a mainstream console anymore. And the exit strategy, if you like, was basically Windows. And that kind of makes sense from that perspective. Building a PC, it's very much current market conditions. And certainly if you're building your own PC, it's more expensive than it was. But, there are bargain forums, for example. There are good deals occasionally on GPUs and CPUs and motherboards, et cetera, et cetera. So, a kind of graceful generation-long transition away from a fixed console platform. Now, I think what's happening now with Asha Sharma is that they've looked at the books and they've said, right, okay, well, the vast majority of our revenues are actually coming from our console audience. We can't risk sort of basically turning our back on the console. We can't diversify as quickly as we intended to in the past. Helix has actually got to be an anchor device for our audience. to transition onto in order to enjoy playing the latest games. And and as you quite rightly say, Oliver, I think the specs for Helix were designed to basically put the console up against pre-built PCs, where it would have offered and probably will still offer substantial value against buying a machine from a mass volume producer like Dell, for example, just because of the nature of the SoC. Contains the CPU, contains the GPU, all of the fabric, all of the bits and pieces in one chip. So, it kind of still might present value, but from a different perspective. But, a mainstream console, that's going to be really tricky. And also, Tom, you're quite right on the messaging, because if the messaging does turn out to be, hey, buy it on Klarna, they're going to be ridiculed. They will be booed and taunted for that. So it's going to be really difficult to actually come out with a plausible way to make this affordable or seem affordable. I'm curious as to what they're going to do there. I just think it's a really, really tricky situation, especially in a world where I don't think they'll be able to guarantee exclusive games. In fact, they can't, because they're coming to PC as well. So strictly speaking, the concept of exclusive is already a thing of the past for Microsoft. The whole argument seems to be about whether it appears on PlayStation or not. That's it. Right. Let's move on. Okay, so got a question here from Lucas _. Hearing you guys talking about the state of Crimson Desert on Steam Deck reminded me of the Forks' video about the latest Halo remake. The visuals were just atrocious looking on the Xbox ROG Ally. I just checked, and that game is Steam Deck verified as well. That kind of makes sense because they got very similar chips. At this point, Valve's verification means absolutely nothing. How are Valve getting away with false advertising like this? If a game shipped on Switch 2 like that, the internet would explode. I guess that's an interesting point, right, Oliver? I mean, what do you make of this? Because obviously you've played a lot of AAA games on the Steam Deck. We did have that series running, which is, can the Steam Deck handle it? Are these games too big for Steam Deck? And we kind of discontinued it because, in your words, it was becoming a bit depressing. So where do you stand on this?
I understand the appeal of wanting to play a game like Crimson Desert or Halo Campaign Evolved on Steam Deck, but fundamentally they're just not good experiences. They're so messy, low frame rates, miserable image quality, not very good. And I think that pattern holds true for a wide number of titles that we see on Steam Deck nowadays. So every time I see a new performance video pop up on the internet, on YouTube, I may not be producing it, but I have eyes and I can see how games are running it. It certainly isn't very good. I do think when Valve does their own analysis of whether games are Steam Deck verified or not Steam Deck verified, they seem to have priorities that are not quite my priorities when it comes to actually evaluating whether a game is Deck verified or not. Because to me, Deck verified seems to suggest, as Valve puts it, the game works right on Steam Deck right out of the box. And then maybe for a game like Crimson Desert, maybe you'd say it's playable. It's got that caution symbol. It's not actually a game that's fully optimized for Steam Deck. But when you look at what Valve is considering, they have 4 boxes. Basically, the first box is input, second box is seamlessness, third box is system support, and fourth box is display. Only one of those boxes has anything to do with the game actually running well, in their words, having good default settings. And even in that setting, they're really talking about, in part about text legibility in games supporting the default resolution of Steam Deck, which is 720p and 800p. So I just think it's a matter of Valve underweighting the category that I think is probably the most important for me. Like if a game has controller input icons that are a little bit inappropriate, or if it shows a keyboard command or something at some point that I swat away with the on-screen keyboard, that's less of an issue for me personally than running at 15 frames per second, because one of those two situations can be rectified with a little bit of on-screen keyboard fiddling perhaps, but obviously the frame rate situation can't be rectified with anything but a more powerful system, which isn't forthcoming anytime soon, I can't imagine. So I think Valve just doesn't have the right priorities when it comes to evaluating games for Steam Deck, because the priorities they have are just not the priorities that I have. And ultimately, I'm kind of very skeptical of AAA on Steam Deck in the first place, like you talked about, at least with respect to much more demanding titles. But I think Valve's verification system should be more stringent when it comes to these games in particular with respect to their performance level.
Right, okay. So, Tom, you don't actually own a Steam Deck, so you've not done a huge amount of Steam Deck gaming
No.
as such. But what would you want in terms of, from a consumer-facing perspective, what do you think Steam Deck Verified should mean?
It should say exactly on the box what you'll get. And I think if they're going through spending the time to verify these things, performance should be a high priority. If it's a fixed spec platform, it should be straightforward. Is this actually running to a reasonable degree? And I suppose there's a bit of subjectivity, but if it's like a 15 FPS and you can barely, it's just like 240p, then okay, let's just call it a write-off and let's move on. Let's not say that it actually works and it's Steam Deck verified on any level. But so I understand that we're very discerning at Digital Foundry, but I think there's a level where even most consumers would just say that's just not acceptable, that's not playable, and I'm not going to accept low frame rates, low resolutions, low settings.
It's interesting because there was during the Steam Machine PR period, they were basically saying that we expect a game to run at a minimum of 1080p at 30 frames per second there. And it doesn't seem to be a similar kind of threshold that applies to Steam Deck Verified, which I find quite interesting. Let's move on. Final question here from Craig.wtf, which is actually his URL as well, which I thought was quite interesting. Salutations, Foundry folk! ! With more and more games moving to Unreal Engine, is it only a matter of time before Epic start working directly with console and GPU manufacturers to influence how they're built? Further to that, Epic could release their own machine to compete with the Steam Machine with Unreal hardware acceleration built in. Pie in the sky, possibly, but stranger things have come to pass. Stranger things? I don't know about that. An engine manufacturer defining a hardware standard, that's quite the thing. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, it's hard to get into the business now, but it's possible. I mean, they've got several things going for them, Epic. They've got the storefront and they've got the engine, the most ubiquitous engine out there. I don't know. I don't think it's really in their sphere of interest, let's say. Like they're thriving on what they've got in terms of supplying a sort of a middleware engine, and they've got enough going for them as they are. I don't know what Unreal hardware acceleration would. I don't know. No, I don't think.
I don't know what that even means. To be honest,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would really work for. I mean, I know UE5 titles. There are plenty, right? Pretty much every other game we cover is UE5, so it would be interesting to have a hardware spec specifically built around UE5 in theory, but also a bit of a nuisance to have another hardware spec to juggle. So I'm not on board with it, but it's an interesting idea.
It's an interesting idea, but come on now. I mean, even Steam, which has a much bigger overall audience. I mean, maybe it's not an engine manufacturer as such to the same scale as Valve. I mean, they went to AMD for hardware. Sony, Microsoft went to AMD for hardware. I'd say that they still have much more of a sway on the industry in terms of overall trends than Unreal Engine, I dare to suggest.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, of course, is that there is such a proliferation of devices now that you kind of... setting aside a device that specifically has hardware optimizations for Unreal Engine, it would be kind of counterproductive because it would be a minority device compared to the majority of devices out there. And I'm not sure what the win is for the consumer in that regard. I think also another thing to bear in mind, Oliver, is that, you've got hardware architects like Mark Cerny who pride themselves on actually going out and speaking to developers when they're architecting the next systems. And obviously they're going to be speaking to Epic, right?
Yeah, I think kind of underrated by this questioner is the possibility that Epic already has enormous influence on the GPU designs that are out there and the console designs that are out there. Indeed, when you go back to the PS5's reveal, the kind of first piece of software, the first piece of rendering load you saw on that device publicly was Lumen in the Land of Nanite, which was an Epic UE5 demo.
Yeah, good
Like
point.
a great Epic UE5 showcase running on PlayStation 5 development hardware, I believe. And so I think they are working with the likes of Sony to define the next generation console spec. Of course, people like Mark Cerny are speaking with Epic and trying to work out what their demands might look like and where they might want to be on next generation console hardware. But I actually think that Epic's story here is a little bit more complicated because Epic is pretty hardware agnostic with respect to the rendering techniques that they pursue. Like when you look at Nanite doesn't use mesh shaders. It uses a compute solution. It doesn't necessarily, also UE5 doesn't necessarily rely on hardware RT, right? It has a software RT solution for its indirect lighting. And it works quite well. So it can run in a wide variety of systems. It does not necessarily require hardware RT. And in general, I would think that the pace of engine development is much faster than the pace of console hardware development, and engines kind of adapt to the console hardware. We've seen this with like Megalights. I don't know that Megalights is ideally suited for PlayStation 5s, but Epic managed to, round hole, square peg, whatever. They managed to make it work just fine. And so I think it's much more the situation where consoles exist and engines adapt. With respect to the idea that Epic could ship like an EGS box, an Epic Games machine, I don't know, Epic Games Store machine, I don't really know that's going to happen because Epic is really inclined towards more open ecosystems. I don't think they have the desire to ship a console. And also, when you look at their business, it's an open platform business. It's Fortnite, which exists on everything. It's Unreal Engine, which supports games shipped on a wide variety of platforms, mostly third-party games, right? That is not a closed platform business predominantly, I wouldn't think. And also, I don't understand how it would serve them to optimize the games around a narrow, small volume hardware product. Like, doesn't make any sense at all. And also, the other thing is they don't have a platform that would support that kind of machine. Like, I don't think anyone would buy an Epic Games Store machine in the same way they would buy a Steam machine. I think the first thing you do with your Epic Games Store machine that you buy from Epic is uninstall EGS, install Steam, and turn it into a Steam box. I don't think you do too much with the EGS machine that actually involves Epic Games Store. That's my own prediction. Who knows? But I mean, I don't think people care for that. So yeah, I don't think it makes any sense. But I do think it makes sense for them to work with hardware vendors. But I do think they're already working with hardware vendors behind the scenes to an extent we probably can't quite comprehend with public information. But certainly they're talking to everyone.
Yeah, and what would happen if the Unreal Engine machine came out and then, a game comes out running at 640p internal resolution? All hell would break loose. But conceivably it could happen. It can't sort of miraculously deliver infinite horsepower for Unreal Engine games that makes all of them look brilliant. I think that's the bottom line as well.
Quite true.
Okay, that was the final question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share, that sort of stuff, bell ringing, what have you. Patreon.com/Digital Foundry. Join us, support the team. Crucially important. Store.digitalfoundry.net for our merchandising wares. But that's all from us on this one, and we guess we'll see you in the next Direct Proper. Thanks for watching.